Hey everyone, this is Glenn Greenwald, and this is my first video discussion for our new subscribers only. And I wanted to first begin by thanking everybody who has subscribed to this really exciting platform that enables and empowers independent journalism. Over the last week, we've gotten an enormous amount of support, an enormous amount of subscriptions that has made me extremely excited about what the next year holds in terms of what we'll be able to do on this platform. And I'm extremely appreciative, grateful for everybody who has subscribed, and also genuinely excited about what journalism will be able to be done as a result of the outpouring of support. So thank you. I want to take a little bit of time to discuss just some of the reactions that I have to the election last night that obviously is not yet concluded. We don't yet know who the winner of the presidential race is. There are several Senate races still outstanding as well, but I think we can formulate some ideas. Earlier this morning, I wrote an article that was available for everybody, lamenting the fact that the United States simply cannot find a way, either out of desire or ineptitude or both, to count votes in a way that is efficient and rapid and that inspires confidence and faith in the democratic process, the way even so many other poorer and less technologically sophisticated countries are able to do with great ease. So if you haven't read that, please do so. I think the concern is that whatever the outcome of the presidential race is, there are obviously going to be a lot of people who doubt its legitimacy, who doubt its authenticity, and you can't really say that they're irrational given the huge amount of chaos and confusion and error and uncertainty that once again plagues the election process. But let's talk about a few of the results. I think one of the things that we have to observe is that this has been a humiliating outcome for so many different centers of authority yet again. Even worse, I would say, than in 2016, even probably not as bad as, say, the 2003 war in Iraq or the 2008 financial crisis, but yet again, institutions of authority are suffering huge justifiable blows to their credibility. Obviously, we can begin with the polling industry and the media's data gurus who rely on it. Over and over, what we've seen are radical errors yet again, probably even worse than 2020, that has led Americans to believe a narrative about this election that turned out to be completely untrue. Now, we don't know the outcome of the presidential election. It's very possible that Joe Biden will still eke out a victory in the Electoral College and perhaps win the popular vote by a fairly comfortable margin. But certainly the polling that has been disseminated over the last couple of months and the narrative that accompanied it is not remotely consonant with the results that we have. And just to give you a couple of examples, if you look at the 538 polling averages, in Florida, for example, 20 of the last 26 polls posted by 538 had Joe Biden winning Florida, 20 out of 26. And as we know, Donald Trump won Florida. In North Carolina, 11 out of the last 12 had Joe Biden winning North Carolina. We don't yet know for certain the outcome of North Carolina, but certainly it won't be anywhere near the margins that those polls suggested Biden would win. There's still a good chance Trump would win, though there's a chance that Joe Biden will win as well. In Wisconsin, 23 out of the last 23 polls not only had Joe Biden winning, but by large margins between 8 and 17%. Wisconsin was just called for Joe Biden by a minute margin of 20,000 votes, nothing like what this polling data suggested. If you go to the Senate races, it's even worse. In Maine, for example, the last 14 polls, 14 out of 14, had Susan Collins losing to her opponent, Sarah Gideon. Sarah Gideon just called Susan Collins and conceded the race. 14 out of 14 polls in Maine. I can't remember the last time I saw a poll that had Susan Collins, the winner of the race, in front. If you go to Iowa, 5 out of the last 6 polls posted by 538 had the challenger defeating the incumbent Republican Senator, Joni Ernst. Joni Ernst won fairly comfortably. In Michigan, the last 16 polls had the Democratic incumbent Senator Peters over his Republican challenger, Jim James, by a margin of between 5 to 15 points. The outcome of that race is in doubt. Whoever wins is going to win by a tiny margin, nowhere near the 5 to 15 points that polls unanimously were showing Peter's likely to win by. The 538 average that predicted the likelihood that Susan Collins would lose was 63%. She won. In North Carolina, the 538 average probability was that the Republican Senator Thom Tillis would lose to his challenger, the Democrat Cunningham. The race is too close to call. Tillis has been in front most of the counting, and it looks at least possible that he would win. But even if he doesn't, it will be nowhere near the polling lopsided disparity that these polls have continuously shown. If you look at House Democrats, who were predicted to pick up large numbers of seats and increase their majority in the House, they ended up losing seats. They lost seats. Their margin of their majority will be smaller in the 2020 to 2022 term than it was from 2018 to 2020, something almost nobody predicted. If you look at the games that were played last night at 10 o'clock p.m., Nate Cohn's New York Times Needle, after a large number of returns had already been in Georgia, up to 80%, predicted that a Trump victory in Georgia was quite likely, above 80% probability. Less than 4 hours later, somehow that needle, even though they had 80% of the returns in, suddenly moved to give Joe Biden a 65% chance of winning. These needles are designed, this probability assessment is designed to cast a facade of scientific expertise and certainty to something which, as we're seeing over and over, they have no certainty, no expertise, no statistical insight into, because they're being continuously proven not just wrong occasionally, but humiliatingly wrong. If you look at the popular vote polling, repeatedly Biden was between 7 and 10%, sometimes even higher, 12%, 15%. We won't know the outcome of the popular vote margin for several weeks until California is done voting and other states are done voting, and it's certainly possible that Joe Biden will end up with a significantly higher popular vote margin than even Hillary Clinton had in 2016, but it certainly seems, at least at the moment, that it will be nowhere near what the polling data reflected. In 2016, there was virtual certainty that Hillary Clinton would win the race, 90%, 95%. The Huffington Post, the New York Times, Nate Silver at 538 lowered his to 70% at the last minute or so. Hillary Clinton ended up losing. In 2020, the same thing. Had Joe Biden at 95%, all of these Senate races, this popular vote percentage, all of which proved to be very, very off base. If Joe Biden does win the Electoral College, as does seem more likely than not at the moment, it certainly will not be by the lopsided margins or with the certainty that these models led people to believe they could once again rely on. So this industry that has made a lot of money and on which people are relying, that media outlets pay a lot of money to employ and that form a lot of our narratives and perceptions about how politics works, there is something clearly fundamentally flawed with what it is that they're doing, in a way that no rational person should continue to vest trust or faith in them until they acknowledge how far off course they've gone and do some self-critique and purport to rectify whatever it is that they're doing that is so wrong. Now, the second point I wanted to make is what all of this says about the Democratic Party. I don't think you can conclude anything other than the fact that even if Biden ekes out a victory, it will be a hideous performance for the Democratic Party, a party that is utterly decrepit and broken fundamentally, the party that lost to Donald Trump despite him being the most unpopular candidate in modern political history in 2016 because it chose a candidate who was almost as unpopular. And now, with conditions as favorable as you can possibly hope for a party, a huge recession, a massive unemployment crisis, rent, people behind on their rent by the tens of millions, a foreclosure crisis, and an out of control pandemic, the Democrats are barely able to beat Donald Trump, even though, as Bloomberg said in June of this year, quote, presidents lose when there's an election year recession. It has been virtually an ironclad law of American politics, and yet Democrats had to struggle not just to beat Trump despite a recession, but all of those other crises, essentially everything that's unraveled and gone wrong, from the sustained protest movements over the last 4 months to economic suffering to the public health care crisis. If Democrats can't easily win an election like this, what can they win? Again, beyond that, they lost seats in the House. They lost seats in the House of Representatives. They were expecting to pick up huge numbers of marginal Republican seats. They didn't. The exact opposite happened. And it looks very unlikely that they'll be able to fulfill their goal of taking over the majority in the Senate, something that looked very likely according to the polls. So even if Joe Biden wins, they'll have a Mitch McConnell to deal with in the Senate. A diminished House majority, with a lot of people looking at what just happened to a lot of their colleagues and probably being scared to support a Democratic majority and Nancy Pelosi, and a 6-3 majority of Supreme Court justices appointed by Republican presidents who have a conservative political ideology. Unless and until Democrats start coming to grips with the fact that their prevailing ideology, which is neoliberalism and targeting college-educated white voters at the expense of the working class and increasingly even people of color, this is a party that is on a collision course with disaster. Donald Trump saved them, as did the coronavirus and the recession that came with it this year, it seems like, at least on the presidential level. But when you look at how they performed in 2016 and now again in 2020, it's hard to conclude that this party is anything other than one that is built on an ideology that is toxic and repellent for very good reasons. And that leads me to my final point, which is it's extraordinarily fascinating why it is that Donald Trump outperformed these polls, why the Republicans did, in terms of who it is that voted for them that people didn't expect. The prevailing media narrative, if you read the New York Times and the Washington Post, if you listen to CNN and MSNBC and the networks, or follow the liberal media, the mainstream media on Twitter, is that the Trump movement is a white nationalist, white supremacist movement built on the loyalty of white men, that they were even losing white women this time, and that essentially it is a dying movement because it depends on white voters. And yet, if you look at who actually voted for Trump, what the Trump coalition is, only a small percentage of his voters are white male. The majority of them are people of color and women together. But even if you look at racial minorities, it's an extraordinary trend. What you see, there was a Twitter thread by the New York Times columnist Charles Blow expressing anger and indignation at shock at what he was seeing. And it's really worth reviewing the polling data that he cited because of how completely it obliterates the media narrative with which we've been drowned for the last 4 years about what the Trump movement is, who Trump voters are, and what the Democratic Party is. This is what he said. He posted just a couple of hours ago this chart. Here are the percentage of black men voting for the Republican candidate. In 2008, 5% of black men voted for John McCain, who we were supposed to believe is a noble, non-racist figure. He only got 5% of black men. In 2012, Mitt Romney doubled that total to 11% of black men who voted for Romney. In 2016, Trump increased it further to 13%. And according to the exit polls cited by Charles Blow, this year, 18% of black men voted for the white nationalist, fascist dictator, white supremacist Donald Trump. 1 out of every 5 African-American men in the United States voted for Donald Trump. Think about how irreconcilable that is with what we're told over and over and over again about what the Trump movement is by media luminaries and rich media stars who have nothing in common with the people on whose behalf they're purporting to represent. Let's continue with what Charles Blow said. He also said, quote, the black male vote for Trump increased from 13% in 2016 to 18% this year. The black female vote for Trump doubled from 4% in 2016 to 8% this year. Trump doubled in 4 years since he's been president his percentage of black women in the United States voting for him to almost 10%, 1 out of every 10 black women, 2 out of every 10 almost black men voting for Donald Trump. Blow also noted, quote, exit polls show a majority of white women voting for Trump. again, just as was true in 2016, although I think it turned out to be a plurality. The polls this time, the exit polls cited by Blow, say that a majority of women, white women, voted for the misogynistic Donald Trump. Blow continued, quote, the percentage of LGBTs voting for Trump doubled from 2016, doubled in his words. And then he added, this is why LGBT people of color don't really trust the white gaze. That's his demographic analysis. He's angry and upset. He doesn't understand why LGBTs, who we were told over and over, are targeted for genocide and discrimination and murder by this fascist dictator. Their numbers doubled after seeing Donald Trump in the White House for 4 years. And then finally he said, quote, the percentage of Latinos and Asians voting for Trump increased from 2016, according to exit polls. Yet more evidence, said Blow, that we can't depend on the, quote, browning of America to dismantle white supremacy and erase anti-blackness, meaning Latinos and Asians, in his view, also voted for white supremacy, which is a very odd sort of trend if you really think about what the premises entail. And I think the reason why this has happened is because the people that we hear from the media, the activist class, the people who work for African-American, Latino, LGBT organizations, the ones who are in the Rolodex of cable hosts and New York Times and Washington Post columns, all have a very narrow provincial view of the world based on their socioeconomic status and their own, quote, lived experiences and their own need to fundraise as well, that requires them to disseminate a narrative that is wildly at odds, as you just saw in the data, with the actual ordinary citizens on whose behalf they're claiming to speak, how they perceive of American politics. They obviously don't perceive in large numbers of Donald Trump as a white supremacist, a fascist dictator, because so many of them voted for him. And I think this is one of the huge problems is in 2016, the media said we became out of touch with the Trump voter, with the Rust Belt, with the Heartland, with people who we thought we were understanding, but we obviously don't because there's no one in our midst. You look at the New York Times op-ed page 4 years later, or the MSNBC and CNN panels, there's not a single person on any of those who supports Donald Trump. They just don't speak to those people. They've disappeared them because they know that their audience doesn't want to hear from them. Is it any wonder, therefore, that they have no idea what those people are like and what they're thinking, given that they're completely excluded from our media discourse? In 2016, the media said, we're going to venture to make sure that we once again reconnect with and regain our understanding of these voters who think differently from us. And 4 years later, media elites and media stars, no matter their race, no matter their ethnicity, no matter their sexual orientation, rich, insulated media elites with the national media are more out of touch with those voters than ever, which is why they're indignant and confused and shocked that these voters in such large numbers voted for the person that they've been saying is the equivalent of Adolf Hitler, who's planning in his second term to create camps for racial minorities. And those racial minorities then went and voted in much larger numbers than ever before. And in some cases, large numbers of 30% and 40% in some states that caused Trump to win those states that polling and the media narrative suggested he would lose for that very person. And I think it's really time that we come to grips with how distorted media narratives are because of the homogeneity that prevails in them. The Democratic Party has a lot of reckoning. The polling industry and data gurus have a lot of reckoning, but for sure, so does the national press. And these are my initial thoughts in addition to the article I wrote this morning, and I'll certainly have a lot more to come as the results come in and things begin to take shape with a bit more finality. Thank you again for listening, and thanks particularly for those of you who have been supporting this platform. It's really meant a lot to me over the last week, which has not been an easy week for me, and it means that I can continue to do journalism how I want, completely unconstrained and liberated from any dogma or faction. So thank you very much.